Thanks, Andy. Thank you. Thanks very much, Andy. Thank you all for coming out tonight. You know, I was joking with Andy. I ran out to get something from my car a few minutes ago, and listen, I'm glad you're here, but I thought to myself, I don't think I'd want to be walking back in right now either. It's a beautiful night. And as my friends here mentioned, on top of that, it is the Red Sox-Yankees at Fenway tonight with early May, and it's a meaningful game. Who would have predicted that? Although I also told Andy, you know, I had even worse luck in 2013 when my first book came out, because I began speaking, it came out in about this time of year, but I really started ramping up the speaking in the fall. So that was the fall of 2013, World Series, Red Sox in the World Series. That was not great. But unlike tonight, where the game starts at 7, the World Series didn't start till 8:30, so I was able to tell everybody, you know, as long as it started at 7, I'll have you home by first pitch. But I can't say that tonight. I'm not going to be able to speak that fast. Anyway, thank you all for coming out tonight. I appreciate it. The other great thing about talking in Wayland tonight is that unlike some nights when I have to drive an hour and a half or 2 hours to get back home, I live just down 27 in Holliston, so it's only going to take me 20 minutes to get home, so thank you. How many of you were at either of my first 2 book talks? Very good. Not enough, but very good. They get extra credit.
We watch Chronicle all the time.
Thank you. This is why I have my Aunt Helen come to every single talk. No, I'm kidding. We've never met, but anyway. Your name's not Helen, is it?
No,
okay. What would the odds have been? Anyway, thank you. So I'm going to talk to you tonight about my newest book, which is all about New England's general stores. And, you know, folks at Chronicle know that there are basically 2 kind of iconic New England institutions that in all my travels around New England, I can't pass by. One is a, you know, genuine old-time diner, and the other is a genuine old-time general store. Now, both have been disappearing over the last 20, 30 years, and you're wondering, why are we having a biology lesson? But, so why am I looking at a dodo bird? So this is an example of an endangered species that became completely extinct. Right? You will not find a dodo bird on the face of the earth today. This is an example of an endangered species that is not yet extinct, right? The white rhino, exactly. And so is this. Now, when it comes to the type of predators that sort of drove general stores to near extinction, well, dodo bird to near extinction, there you go. When it comes to the type of predator that has driven general stores, I should say, to near extinction, I'm going to tell you right now that none of our hands are clean. You may have consorted with one of these predators recently. We all have. But there's a reason why I chose these 2 very modern iterations of these 2 big box stores. This is still in the design phase. And the reason is to point up the fact that the demise of the general store is not a new phenomenon. Right? Very new stores, big box stores. Big box stores did not threaten general stores with extinction. They don't help, but they didn't threaten general stores with extinction. That happened long before the rise of the big box stores. In fact, when general stores began to be threatened with extinction, Sam Walton was still running things out of a single store in Missouri. So that's how far back it goes. It goes back more than half a century. It goes back more than half a century. And I like to point out one of my favorite chroniclers of American popular culture, John Steinbeck, was one of the first to notice that general stores, not just in New England, everywhere, were beginning to disappear. You know, in 1960, as you might recall, he set out with his best friend Charlie in his custom-built GMC pickup truck with the camper in the back that he nicknamed Rocinante. Anybody know what Rocinante refers to? No? Rocinante was Don Quixote's horse. Leave it to Steinbeck to name a pickup truck with a literary reference. But he did. He circumnavigated America, as you know, and wrote Travels with Charlie. But look what John Steinbeck noticed more than half a century ago. That the big stores, the big towns were getting bigger, the villages smaller, and the small hamlet store, the hardware store, the little haberdasheries, or the general store were beginning to disappear. And he noticed that more than half a century ago. So what happened? So when Steinbeck was born in Salinas, California, this was a scene, an image that had instant familiarity with every single American, coast to coast. Didn't matter where you lived. It didn't matter whether you frequented this store like this once a day or once a week. It was something that was familiar. As familiar to Americans in 1900, that scene, as the shot of that big box store would be familiar to Americans today. And so what happens? Well, this is what happened. So go 50 years out from 1900, the end of the Second World War, and you have an economic boom. There's a housing shortage, but there's an economic boom. And for the first time in 1950, a majority of Americans own an automobile. So I always say, you know, you can reduce the threat to general stores where they began the slide to what might have been complete extinction with just 3 letters. C-A-R, the car. The car. Why? Because the car meant mobility. The car meant that people could move. The car meant that people could essentially choose with their feet or their wheels if they wanted to make a different choice with what they bought and where they shop. Because, you know, 20 years later, you have the mushrooming of the interstate highway system. And the thing is, if this is the type of store that you frequent and this is the level of choice that you've grown up with, and now you can just jump in your car and drive a couple of exits on the interstate and you have this. And if this is what you're offering your customers, it's a little hard to compete with this. So a funny thing happened on the way to extinction. So we're setting this up that, you know, general stores were threatened with extinction, and indeed they were. They were. But a funny thing happened, and it's this irony that made me want to write the book. Because the very factors that threaten general stores with complete extinction become the same factors that help save them. And while that sounds like a paradox, it's the central irony of the whole book. Because by the time you get to the early 70s, late 60s, 70s, you have this mushrooming of suburbia, right? And this is California, but it's the same scene coast to coast. You have the mushrooming of suburbia, which goes hand in hand with the rise of the interstate highway system, with the increase in mobility, and now folks can move wherever they want for work. There's no sense of being hemmed in geographically anymore, right? So you go where you want. You have more and more two-parent families where both parents are working, or single family. The point is that the rise of suburbia does things to the American community. And while that's the first time I've said that word tonight, that's what general stores are all about, community. I would say the reason why general stores still survive has nothing to do with a single item that is on a single shelf in a single general store. It's nothing that a general store sells. It is what a general store means to people when they're in a real one. And by a real one, I mean a community gathering place. I always say, let me say, I always say at the beginning what this book is not, because it all has to do with being a community gathering place. So it's not a comprehensive listing of New England's general stores. All of New England's general stores, not in this book. What it is a group of stores that tell a story of why general stores still matter. Perhaps today more than ever. Every store in the book, there's about 50 of them, but every store in the book has been around for at least 100 years, and 3/4 of them have been around for twice that long, 200 plus years. They've been a general store in the same physical footprint all of that time, and they have never been anything but a general store. But the most important metric is that every single store in the book is a genuine community gathering place. You can't be a general store in name only. And I'm sure, we all pass, right? You're in the middle of East Oshkosh, and you pass a little package store or a little variety store, and it says, East Oshkosh General Store, right? But it's not. It's not. It's not unless it is an actual community gathering place that is central to that community. That's why general stores still matter. That's why they were saved from extinction. So back to this scene. So by the time you get to the late 60s and 70s, you have the rise of suburbia in a way that never existed in America before. And in these super communities, as I call them, you have a level of infrastructure and amenities that, as the boomers who are moving to them and inhabiting them, as their parents could only have dreamed about. Great school systems in many cases, great sports programs and athletic fields and programs and community swimming pools. But you know what? A lot of people in these super suburban communities, by the time you get to the late 70s, mid 80s, early 80s, it's hard to pinpoint exactly, but it's in that kind of 10 years, a lot of folks in these big suburban communities and the rise of suburban sprawl miss something. They may not, in many cases, they're not even aware of exactly what it is they're missing. But there's a yearning and they miss something. And again, irony of ironies, in these vast suburban communities that seem to have everything, you know what it is a lot of people miss? Community. So it turns out you can live cheek by jowl with your neighbor and still be lonely. Anybody ever heard of a book called Bowling Alone? Right. So it's, as you know, it is exactly this dynamic, right? And so at this point of time in America, by the 80s, the sense of community in a lot of places is being diffused. And a lot of people aren't even necessarily consciously aware that they're missing it, but they are. You know who did notice it? An incredible, I think, an extraordinary American who is not nearly well known enough, Ray Oldenburg. Ray Oldenburg, anybody ever hear of the theory of the third place? Yeah? So Ray Oldenburg is an American sociologist who in the late 80s, he spent 10 years doing this research, and in the late 80s, he published it in the form of this book called The Great Good Place. And what Ray Oldenburg found that was groundbreaking, and it has everything to do, I'm not going off in a windy dissertation about Ray Oldenburg's theory about the third place, but it has everything to do with general stores. Because what Ray Oldenburg found was that although we Americans think that we are incredibly mobile, and we may be, but nonetheless, however free as a bird and mobile we think we are, we still spend the vast majority of our lives, he found, in one of just three places. The first place, which is home, the second place, which is work, and the third place, that's where it gets interesting. So the third place is not one single place. The third place can be one of many different kinds of places, but the important thing is what all third places have in common. A third place can be a house of worship. It could be a place where you get your hair done. It could be a place where you run in and grab a coffee, or it could be a public library. It could be a corner bar where they really do know your name. The important thing about a third place is that it is a place, like a general store, where when you go there, I always feel like going into Robert Frost's definition of home because it starts the same way. You know Robert Frost's definition, how he defined home? Robert Frost defined home as, starts out the same way, right? Home is that place where when you go there, they have to take you in. Right? That's it. That's home. So the third place, as defined by, for instance, a general store, are these places where when you go there, you may be going to do a discrete, assigned, dedicated task, right? You might be going to pray. You might be going to get a carton of eggs. You might be going to return a book. You might be going to get your hair done. But when you go there to one of these third places, you have the expectation, even if it's unconscious, that you will be interacting with people from your community. And it turns out, Ray Oldenburg found, that we need that. People need that. It isn't just like, it isn't a luxury. When we miss it, when it's gone, when we don't have it, when they disappear, when these third places disappear from communities, people miss them. I don't mean miss them like wistful. I mean they feel like something is missing in their lives. And a lot of those people in those big suburban communities actually felt strongly enough that they become the first wave of people who will save general stores because they felt like as these boomers began to have children of their own, start their own families, they really felt, many of these people felt, there wasn't a massive wave, but a sizable enough that it shows up in the data, that they felt like, we're going to move out. And they moved to small towns around New England, where they were determined to recover that sense of community that perhaps they grew up with, the parents certainly grew up with, and they felt like these big super suburban tract communities just don't feel like a community to me. And so they moved to small cities and towns all over New England, and as I said, they become the first wave of people who will be in position to save the general store. Because that's why they moved to these places like Barnard, Vermont. It was all over Whitefield, Maine, and South Ackworth, New Hampshire, Shrewsbury, Vermont. But they moved to places like Barnard, Vermont, where the same scene that existed in 1945 existed in 1985 and in 2005. The exact same store. So this is great, right? So they moved to these small towns like Barnard, Vermont, and they were delighted because they found what they were looking for. These weren't the only third places in these wonderful towns like Barnard, Vermont. They also found wonderful small places of worship and small, wonderful local libraries, right? So this was the sense of community they were after. Unfortunately, by the time you get to about the year 2000, so it turns out that general store owners, because a lot of these boomers also bought general stores. And by the time you get to about 2000, it's kind of a perfect storm. You've got people who are coming up in terms of the shelf life of owning a general store of about 20 years, which is about the average. So they're ready to sort of think about retiring, maybe see who is interested in buying the store, keeping it going. And then you have a terrible recession starting in the late 80s. So the economy's terrible. You don't have a lot of people coming forward to buy the general store. And a year later, you have a tipping point because in the wake of 9/11, around New England, tourism is off in many towns almost 90%. If you recall, nobody was traveling. Nobody felt like traveling that fall. And a lot of these stores closed. Wave of general store closings. And it really did seem around 2000, 2001, 2002, it really did seem like the skids are greased and general stores are going to become a relic. They'll just all close. Who's going to, nobody's going to buy them. So it turns out for the first general stores to be saved, the first model of how to save a general store around that time period, right, was towns coming together, taking a village to save the general store. I mentioned South Ackworth. It's a perfect case in point. There'd been a general store in South Ackworth, New Hampshire, like as I said, most of the stores in this book for over 200 years. But by the time you get to 2000, and then 2001, the general store owners in this case had owned it for 37 years, well above average. But nobody wanted to buy the store. What are they supposed to do? Run it for free? So the store closed. And the people in South Ackworth spent a couple of years realizing that the heart and soul of their town was no longer beating. And it felt like a terrible hole in the fabric of their community. And they realized the only way, if nobody's going to do it by themselves, was to come together and pool their resources and buy the store, which they did. And they formed a co-op, just like a food co-op. And just like a food co-op, they all went to work inside the store. They created a cafe, put in a set number of hours. You get a set discount on your groceries, right? They built a pizza oven out back years later, bring in more revenue. They do harvest dinners. They bring in visiting chefs now. And today, the South Ackworth Village store is thriving like it never did before. You have chefs now that are scheduled years in advance to do those harvest dinners in South Ackworth. And by the way, if you ever have a chance to go to one, one of the most delicious evenings you'll ever have. One of the most and the lights are on. I hope they don't go off anytime soon in South Ackworth. But in North Shrewsbury, Vermont, which I also mentioned, a different story about how the village saved the general store, and all was good. This is a case where, unlike South Ackworth, Mother Nature got involved. How's that? Well, when the time this picture was taken, Marjorie Pierce right here was in her early 70s. And at that time, her family, the Pierces, had already owned and operated Pierce's Village store, which is absolutely the heart and soul. It's the only thing in North Shrewsbury, Vermont. And but she was, 20 years later, she was in her early 90s, okay? And really, to be perfectly truthful, she wanted nothing more than to just take a little time off, get off her feet. Who could blame her? Woman's 95, right? Nobody blamed her. The problem was she wanted to sell the store, and nobody wanted to buy it. the hell is she supposed to do? So she had to close the store. And for the next several years, people in North Shrewsbury, Vermont were just devastated. Now, they didn't want to make her feel guilty, but nonetheless, they felt devastated. So Marjorie Pierce called up a friend of hers, Paul Brune. Paul Brune happens to be one of my very favorite New Englanders. He is the founder and executive director today of the Preservation Trust of Vermont, which is a really visionary organization. Started out doing what it does in Vermont today. It does it all over New England, all over the country. They help cities and towns hold on to their history, not out of a overdeveloped sense of sentimentality or nostalgia, but because they have the data to show now that municipalities that preserve their history, whether it's a historic theater or a historic shopping district or a main street, those places that hold on to their history, they have found and can prove it, have a much clearer path to economic sustainability and viability in the future than places that pave it over, knock it down, and then somehow hope that these big vacant lots will attract big development. Doesn't happen. So she called up Paul Brune, and she didn't want to talk about economic sustainability. Oh, well, in a way she did. She called him up. She said, Paul, I have to talk to you. So he jumped in his beat-up Prius, and he drove down from Burlington, because what else would you be driving from Burlington except a beat-up Prius? And she said, Paul, I need to reopen the store. And he said, Marjorie, dear, how are you going to do that? And she said, I'm not going to do it. You are. He said, excuse me? She said, I'm going to make you an offer. I'm going to give you the store. And I'm going to give you $10,000, which is pretty much all the money I have, but I don't expect to need it too much more. And he said, Marjorie, dear, well, the problem was the Preservation Trust does not own property outright, right? He tried to explain to her that's not what they do. What they do is they help cities and towns invest in their own future. They help cities and towns take over their own properties and become owners of their properties and their future. But as he said to her, he said, Marjorie, we don't own properties outright. It's not what we do, dear. And she said, piffle. Well, it went back and forth a little bit. But long story short, about 30 minutes later, Paul was back in his beat-up Prius making his way back up to Burlington, and the Preservation Trust owned its first piece of property outright. As Paul said, I couldn't say no to this lady. So he did come back down about 2 weeks later, and he met with the local historical group, which he had tipped off, like my friend Sally Deinzer there, and who heads it, and he had tipped them off that he needed to talk to them because they were going to play a central role, he said, in the running of Pierce's, now that the Preservation Trust had the deed to the store. And they said, well, great. And he said, well, by run it, I mean, you are going to operate the store. We're not going to have anything to do with it. And they were mortified because these were farmers and craftspeople. Somebody said, Paul, I make macrame. What do I know from running a store? And he said, well, we are going to mentor you folks, and they've done this before, and they did it again. And they learned how to operate a business. They learned about balance sheets. They learned how to order product and how to do inventory and how to promote the store. And they completely renovated the store and did an amazing job, I think. And look, it didn't go off without a hitch. I mean, there were plenty of hiccups along the way. In fact, just before they reopened in 2009, they went to the town and they asked for an additional $2,500 for an emergency generator. And there was a bit of belly aching. You know, more than one person said, well, Marjorie Pierce never needed an emergency generator. But they said, if we are going to be a genuine community gathering place, and the town will know and have confidence that through thick and thin and the worst that a Vermont winter can throw at us will be open, we need to be able to say with confidence that the lights will be on and will be open. So they got the generator, and they did reopen, and the beating heart of Shrewsbury, Vermont was beating once again, and all was good until 2 years later, when Mother Nature had her say. Right. So in August 2011, you may recall, Hurricane Irene, although it was downgraded to a tropical storm by the time it reached Vermont, it tore into the Green Mountains. And it was Vermont's worst natural disaster in its history. And the first day that Irene hit Vermont, the power went out all over Vermont, and the lights went out all over Vermont, including little Shrewsbury, Vermont. And you may recall it took covered bridges out all over the state. Very sad. But the power went out everywhere. The lights went out everywhere, including Shrewsbury, except in one little spot. Because in North Shrewsbury, Vermont, that crew trudged over in the wind and the rain and the debris, and they fired up that emergency generator, and the lights came on, and people trudged up that hill like zombies out of the night, and they got to Pierce's, and the coffee was hot, and the lights were on, and the Wi-Fi was working, and they were able to tell their relatives everything's okay, and nobody has bellyached about that emergency generator ever again. Now, we talked about a town saving the store, that these first stores were saved by a village, essentially. But, there have also been just wonderful, remarkable individuals who have been able to save a store all by themselves. One of my favorites is not very far from here. How many of you know Ferns? How many of you know Ferns? Sure. And in the chapter, Honey, I Bought the Store, in the book, I like to joke that my friend Larry Beerfield is the only person in the chapter to have actually uttered those words verbatim to his lovely wife, Robin, Honey, I bought the store. I told him, if I know Robin, you're very lucky she didn't say, I hope you still have the receipt, okay? Because we're not writing a store. But my favorite Honey, I Bought the Store involves Hollywood star Steve Carell, otherwise known probably as America's worst boss. But, Steve Carell grew up very close by here, very close, Acton. But I know what you're thinking. Now he's down in the South Shore sometimes. But he grew up very close to here, a couple towns over in Acton. And, when I interviewed Steve for the book, I asked him, where does your interest in general stores come from? And he said that when he was growing up there was a general store, long gone, but he said he was entranced by this general store. And he would go there. It turned out it was the first place that little Stevie Carell, as a little boy, was allowed to go on his bike by himself with his allowance and buy penny candy. Exactly. With a note. How many of you had the same experience? How many of you had the same experience? Right? I love asking that question because usually all the hands in the room go up. It was the same for me. Same for me. I grew up in Winthrop, right? Just to the east on the harbor, or as I like to refer to it, the charming little seaside town at the end of runway 27L. But it was a noisy childhood. But same thing. Got to ride my bike to Little Brass Variety Store, which was the first place I can recall I was allowed to go by myself and do business. And it was the same for Steve. It was also the same for his lovely wife, Nancy. Now, she grew up in the South Shore. She grew up in Cohasset. And she and her big sister, Tish, used to go on summer evenings in next door to Marshfield Hills, actually, where they would go to the Marshfield Hills General Store. And about 10 years ago, 15 years ago, Steve's sister-in-law, Tish, Nancy's his wife's big sister, went out to LA to visit Steve and her sister. And she told Nancy, who's right here, there she is, does that look like the proud owners of an old New England General Store? Not so much, right? And yet that's who they are. You are looking at the proud owners of an old New England General Store. Because when Nancy's sister Tish came out to visit, she told Nancy that the Marshfield Hills General Store, which was such a dear part of their youth, she said was up for sale. And she said it's been languishing for sale. Nobody seems to have come forward to express any interest in buying it. And at that point, Steve said he walked into the kitchen where they were talking, and he entered the conversation. And long story short, when Nancy's sister Tish returned east that winter, she had with her a check to purchase the Marshfield Hills General Store. And it is a very authentic old New England General Store. In fact, it is still one of the few general stores in New England that has a working post office attached to it. That used to be the case at every general store, but it's harder to find. During the Civil War on the third floor, they stitched Union Army uniforms here. And I think the Carells and Tish did a wonderful job of preserving the integrity of that historic store. And Steve did make his sister-in-law Tish the general manager of the store. And today the Carells own a house in Cohasset. They're out here for several weeks every summer. And today no summer in Marshfield Hills is complete without a confirmed Carell sighting, as you can see there. So we've talked about villages saving the first wave of general stores that were threatened. We've talked about some remarkable individuals coming forward on their own to save a store. But in putting this talk together, I felt like it was important to sort of pay some homage to some wonderful general stores around New England, of which I'm just going to share one, that are sort of they're part of a group I call Tried and True, because they're all of the above. They've never needed to be saved because they are such an integral part of their community that the very idea of them being up for sale is inconceivable. It's inconceivable to people in places like Warren, Vermont. In Warren, Vermont, there's been a general store like so many others for over 200 years. There it is in the early 1940s. It really is. I've used that term a lot, but it is the heart and soul of Warren, Vermont, up in ski country there. And if you are within 20 miles of that store, you would drop into that store. People drop in, some people a couple of times a day. We'll have lunch, we'll have breakfast. It's just that kind of place. And the last time I was up at the Warren store was about a year ago this past March, which made it 2016. It was 2016, 2 years ago, this past March, because it was an election year. You may or may not want to remember, but it was an election year. And it was primary season, and I dropped in, and I asked my friend Jack Garvin, who owns the store, what's new? And he said, well, what's new? Oh, he said, we're having some fun with a contest right now to name the stove. Now, most general stores have some form of a wood stove, but the Warren store, it's enormous. It's like the defining feature of the store. It's huge. And they were having a contest to give the store a name, give the stove a name. And I said, well, have you had any good candidates for a name yet? And he said, funny you should use that word. So it turns out that just a week before I was there, another good friend of the store had dropped in, which surprised me. I didn't know he was back in Vermont because he was a pretty busy guy at that point in time. He might have been back in Burlington doing laundry for all I know, but he dropped into the store to say hi. And unlike me, he was quicker on his feet, and he had a suggestion. He had a suggestion for a name for the stove. And guess what? They liked it. They liked it. They liked it, and it stuck, Yeah. And I always wondered if within 2 months he missed out on the Democratic presidential nomination, Bernie Sanders did. But I've always wondered if maybe on some level that he didn't really share publicly, he found some small consolation in that, unlike Hillary, he won the stove naming contest at the Warren store. So that's not nothing. That's not nothing. But there is also, one of my favorite chapters is something I call one of a kind, because it is truly all of the above. The two stores I'm going to quickly share with you are all of the above. They are tried and true. They have never been up for sale. They will probably never be up for sale because they're so unique and they're so much a part of the communities that they're in. One of them is in Vermont. I always want to say New Hampshire because it's just over on the other side of the Connecticut River from Hanover, New Hampshire, in the Upper Valley area, Norwich, Vermont. And Dan and Witz are not the original owners. Dan and Witz were high school buddies who worked at the store in the 1930s when they were going to high school together in Norwich. And then by the 1950s, they owned the store. And they did very well. You can tell by the confidence in putting out this sign, they did very well. You'll find a variation on that sign in many, many general stores. The difference with Dan and Witz, I always point out, is that it might be true. So here's the thing. They did well. They wanted to expand. The thing was, they had a very small footprint with which to work with, right? They couldn't expand on this side because there's a street right there. And they couldn't expand on this side because the Norwich Inn is right here. So the only option for expansion was to expand in the back, where there was about 3/4 of an acre directly behind the store. So you can't see. The store doesn't look huge, but you can't see what's in back. So when you walk in, this is what you see from the front door, right? I took that picture from the front door. So from the front door to where that guy and his son are standing at the cooler is less than the distance from where I am to the back wall, right? Not very far. However, if you walk just to the left of where they are, right, just to the meat counter, just a few feet away there is a doorway. There's no sign, there's no door on the doorway, but if you walk through the door, you're in the back, which is where they expanded. and it's huge. It actually, the ceiling looks like a box store. And you can get lost back there. I say that because I did. The first time I was back there, I got lost. I was with Dan Fraser, who's the grandson of the original Dan, and it was a late winter day, and he said, listen, we're short-handed, I got to go back out to the front, but you're welcome to walk around. I said, fine. And I did for a few minutes, and then I couldn't find my way back out. I kid you not. Every aisle I turned in, I said, this is ridiculous, you know? And I started trying to, like you would in the woods, right? They say, you know, focus on one tree. Get to that tree, focus on the next tree, right? So I was like, okay, focus on that flower pot, okay? I get to the flower pot, focus on the cedar, you know? But I still was like, I finally got out of there, obviously. And I said to Dan, I said, I just got lost in that damn back room. And he said, oh, happens all the time. So it turns out, they're prepared for this, it turns out that at Dan and Witt's, they have the commercial equivalent of the ski patrol. Now, you may know that the ski patrol at a ski area, you know, when the lifts close, you know, usually 4:30, depending on the time of year, they will, once the lifts close and skiers aren't going up the mountain anymore, they will send a ski patrol person down to flush out every slope and every trail, make sure nobody, God forbid, is left behind when it gets dark, right? They do the same thing at Dan and Witt's. So every night at 9 o'clock, somebody goes out in the back and flushes it out, and I said, you ever find anybody back there? He said, like all the time. I said, oh, he said, I don't know. He said, once a week we find some 10-year-old kid back there. I said, that's terrible. He said, no, you know what's really terrible? He said, usually we know for a fact their parents left an hour ago. I'm just reporting. So my other tried and true is even more unique. In Windsor, Maine, Harlan Hussey, looks like Hussey. He was a German immigrant, pronounced it Hussey. And he also, like Dan and Witt's, did very well. And by the 1950s, he was able to enlarge his little tiny one-story general store into this 3-story colossus that is the central point of Windsor, Maine. 3 floors, there's a basement, there's a first floor, there's a second floor. And what makes Hussey's really unique is that it sells something in a particular combination that is unique in all the world. If you want, this is the sign, when you walk in on the first floor, you will see this guide sign. For maximum impact, start reading from the bottom, okay? So nothing surprising so far. Wood stoves, home and gardening, plumbing, electrical, paint, hardware, camping gear, fishing, hunting supplies, guns, bridal gowns, clothing. Whoa, what? Right, bridal gowns. So Hussey's of Little Windsor, Maine, in the middle of nowhere, is apparently, we have found, the only general store in the world where you can buy the combination of guns, gowns, and beer. Guns, gowns, and beer. Or basically, one-stop shopping for a shotgun wedding. I'm not kidding. That's exactly what Harlan Hussey's granddaughter, Kristen, had some fun with. That's her wedding picture. See? And so she posed under the sign, and there's the lovely bride holding a bridal bouquet, a 6-pack of Schlitz, and the groom is holding a brand new 12-gauge. Now, lastly, just to get a little bit serious for a moment, you know, I changed this a little while ago, a few months ago, because every night, and I will tonight too, although it depends if you want to get back by the 3rd inning. But I will tonight too, which is I'm happy always to take a question or two, right? And when I started doing this talk about 8 months ago, every single night, and I have no doubt if I didn't include this part of the talk to end, I would get asked again tonight. Was anybody thinking of asking me if I had a favorite general store? There was one that was my favorite. So I would get, it seemed like every time I did a talk, I was asked that. That's not what surprises me. What began to surprise me was that my answer was invariably the same, which was food for thought, right? I started to ponder that. Well, why is it? Why do I say that's my favorite store every night? I hadn't planned on that. I had never thought in terms of a favorite general store. I like so many of these general stores. I visited over 70. There are 50 in the book. I've probably been in over 100 over my travels. I never thought about one being a favorite. I mean, I think of, for different reasons, you know. I mean, Harrisville, and Harrisville, New Hampshire is my favorite because, you know, it has the best BLT I've ever eaten. You know, another is my favorite because it has just the best little tables by the window that on a late winter day is just the warmest, wonderful place to sit and read for a little while. But this was, invariably, I would say this was my favorite general store. So I started to think about why. And then I thought, well, this goes right to the very heart of why general stores still matter and how much a general store can matter to a community, especially when they lose it. And nobody knows that better than the people in Putney, Vermont, little Putney, Vermont, population just under 1,000 people. And in Putney, there has been a general store in that exact same spot for over 200 years. Over 200 years, 1796, if I'm not mistaken. A.M. Corser, just one of almost 15 different general store owners over that 200-plus year period. And it has always occupied the same spot just above Little Sackett's Brook in the middle of Putney, and has always looked, as you can see, pretty darn similar. And it has always been the beating heart of Putney, Vermont, except those periods when it wasn't there. Anybody curious how that would be? Right. Well, the first time it almost wasn't there was on a terrible night in 2008 when some faulty wiring in the attic broke out, and about 2 o'clock in the morning, and thank goodness for volunteer fire departments, because, you know, when you live in a place where there's a volunteer fire department, the fire only goes out as fast as you can muster the folks whose job it is to come and try to put it out. And they got there pretty quickly. And they were able to, it looks bad, but they were able to save almost 2/3 of the store. And it fell to people like Lisa Papazian, who made her first call the morning after the fire to our friend Paul Brune, who jumped in his beat-up Prius and drove down from Burlington to Little Putney this time. And they wanted to talk to Paul about what they should do next. And Paul said, well, he said, first thing we're going to do is we are going to find a way to restructure things so that you folks, the Historical Society, become owners of your history. This is your store, and you should be owning this store. Because part of the problem in the wake of the fire was the owners did not have insurance. Not good. And they took off because it was a total loss as far as not, I mean, not to make light, but they had no further reason to stay in Putney. However, the store was reason enough for people in Putney to figure out how to save it and rebuild it, and they did. And he helped them, working with Bernie Sanders and Pat Leahy and others. They found federal money and state money, and they raised a lot of money, and they were able to come together, and the Historical Society became owners of the store, and they rebuilt the store, and the store reopened, and all was good, and the beating heart of Putney was beating again, but it was short-lived. It was short-lived. How short? A year and a half later. A year and a half later. So as bad as this looks, it's worse than it looks. It's worse than that looks. Why? Because this time there was no faulty wiring in the attic. This time, investigators found traces of massive accelerant throughout the building. Arson. So this time, the folks in Putney, Vermont had to deal with the double gut punch that not only had they just lost the beating heart and soul of their community, but the person who did this might be their neighbor. Who knows? So it was awful. The building was a total loss, burned right down to the foundation stones, and the people in Putney, Vermont that late fall felt as if there'd been a death in the family. Because in a very real way, there had been. The store was like extended family to the whole town. And it fell to Lisa Papazian to once again call Paul Brune, and he once again drove down to Putney. But this time, he was much more pessimistic. As he pointed out to Lisa, he said, you know, it's only a year and a half. He said, some of the money that we've got coming in federal and matching loans and so forth, it's still in the pipeline. We don't even have the money yet, and the store's gone. So there was terrible anguish, and people just didn't know what to do. And he met with them. He met with them at the little church across the street from where the store had stood. It was early in the morning. It was about 7 o'clock in the morning, a cold January morning. And after about an hour, about 40, 50 more people showed up, people in town who'd heard about the meeting. after another half hour, there was over 100 people. They had to move the meeting out of the church, out into the cold open air. And after a time, an old gentleman whose family went back 5 generations in Putney stood up and he said, I'm just going to tell you all this. He said, I will be goddamned if an arsonist is going to define my town. And Paul Brune kind of let his words hang in the cold air. And he stood up and he said, well, looks like we need to rebuild then. And they did. And the one single silver lining of the second terrible Putney fire was that as you reacted, people reacted that way nationally, internationally. People were just, they couldn't believe that this small little town that had rebuilt their cherished little store lost it again a year and a half later. And money came in from everywhere, everywhere. And they were able to rebuild the store, this time completely with donated labor and time, and all was wonderful again. They still needed someone to run the store, right? The town owned it. They needed someone to run it. They found a wonderful, wonderful person, local pharmacist whose family had emigrated here, and he felt like the store had been like extended family to his family, and he said, you know what, if I can run the pharmacy, my pharmacy, out of the second floor, I'd be happy to run the store. And they said, great. They said, great, and he opened up his pharmacy on the second floor, and all was wonderful until January 1st last year, when this lovely little man died. Yep, and to make matters worse, neither of his 2 kids wanted anything to do with running the store, and the store closed again. But there's a reason I call this store the Phoenix. But Paul Brune, this time, he called Lisa Papazian, and he said, Lisa, I know you closed the store again. I understand. I sympathize. But he said, I'm going to tell you something I built up from years of experience with things like this. He said, you know, the longer that store stays closed, the longer the road back to reopening will be. Mark my words. He said, you've got a bunch of people in that historical society now. He said, what do you have, more than 40 people? He said, yeah. He said, well, why don't you each put an hour a week, okay, and reopen that store until you can get someone to run it. And they did. And they reopened last May, and it is beautiful again. And it is, as Paul puts it so well, truly about perseverance. And just as I close, I feel like it wouldn't be right to finish this talk. And by the way, you know, we're talking about general stores being saved. It's not that there haven't been casualties, and there have been significant stores that have been lost. And recently, how recently? Well, just 6 years ago, the most famous general store in America, Gray's, in Adamsville, Little Compton, Rhode Island. When the time it closed, it was the oldest continuously operating general store in America, 224 years, or just less than 20 years than the country itself had been in business. So, and more recently, how recently? The Monterey General Store. The Monterey General Store is in the book. Why is it in the book? Because when the book went to press last fall, it was still open. Now it's closed. So it's a precarious existence still. But the reason why I like to point out the new breed of general store owners is that without this new younger breed that is interested in owning general stores, there wouldn't be a single store that's in that book still open in 20 years. I'd be willing to bet anything. Bet anything. The reason is that there are young people now that are interested in running general stores. And believe it or not, many of the millennials, under 30. And it might not be a generation, I always say, you know, curiously, that a lot of people would think would have the same feeling about community, perhaps, in the same way that their parents or their grandparents do. But a lot of them do. A lot of them do. My favorite in Whitefield, Maine is Taryn and Ben Marcus. Perfect example of this new breed. They may look more like general store owners, but don't be surprised. That's deceptive. They're farmers. No interest ever in growing up and becoming adults, in being in business and running a store. They met at agriculture school in Washington State. They moved back to Whitefield, Maine, because that's where Ben's family was from, and they hoped to be able to afford a few acres of land to farm, but they couldn't. They kept looking, but they couldn't. And finally, a guy came up to them one day and he said, I'll tell you what. He said, I will make you a crazy offer. He said, I will give you 5 acres of prime farmland. They said, what's the catch? He said, the catch is, on that prime farmland, there is a long-closed, defunct general store, Sheepscot General Store. He said it's been closed for about 25 years. I've always thought I would reopen it, but I don't think I am. But if you will reopen the store, the land is yours. And they did. And they did, and they farmed the land, and they got great organic produce, and they started selling it in the store. And then after about 6 months, they looked at each other, they said, you know what if we, instead of driving the hundreds of miles a week that we have to do like every farmer, for the most part in New England, to hit every single farmer's market that we can every week, what if we could find someone to open up a little cafe, a kitchen at the store? And they did. And they did, and they sold and cooked with their own produce, and they started opening up all kinds of new little things at the store, which I grant you, if you're a general store purist, okay, or you had Lastman and Sheepscot General Store 100 years ago, I grant you, you would wonder, what the hell is a wine tasting doing in my store? And what is an open mic? In fact, what's a mic? Right? I grant you, yes. But you know what? These are the things that keep Sheepscot General Store open today. Because what the new breed of general store owners understand is the same thing that good libraries understand today. They're not the libraries of your... You know, one of the dirty little secrets of libraries today, and I'm passionate about public libraries, but one of the things that libraries know today that is kind of like a dirty little secret, which is that public libraries in general, are not so much about books anymore. You have many different ways to get books to read. Libraries are one of them, but it's only one of many ways you can get a book. And for a lot of people, they're not even thinking books when they come to libraries. They're thinking of the other kinds of services and programs that libraries, the good ones, understand they need to offer today. There are libraries in Massachusetts that rent kayaks in the summer and cross-country skis in the winter. There are libraries where you can rent a tool for the weekend task, job you're doing, right? Now, you would have walked into a library 100 years ago, what? But that's what they understand today. That's what general store owners understand today. You have to serve the community you're in. And Ben and Taryn Marcus understand that like few others. And now today at Sheepscot General, yes, there's wine tastings, there's an open mic night, there's yoga classes, there's child care. They opened a small lending library, and it's popular again with young and old. And it gives hope, I think. And what could give more hope about the future of general stores than the reopening of Hope General in 2016, that this new breed, I think, does give hope that general stores will be preserved as these quintessential third places in American life into the future. And that is New England's general stores. Thank you. Thank you. So, true to my word, I'm happy to take a question or two, if anybody has a question or two, but now you don't have to ask what's my favorite general store. Yes?
Well, the reason why general stores are lasting today is called entrepreneurship.
Well, the good ones, that's why they last.
That's right.
Right, the bad ones don't, because that's lack of entrepreneurship. Right. But you know, it isn't just about entrepreneurship. It really isn't. I grant you, that's easily 50%. Because I always say with general stores, you know, it's funny how much books and libraries I find overlap with general stores. If you say to the average person, do you like good old bookstores? Who doesn't like a bookstore, right? And you say, how often do you support one? That's the look, right? Well, guess what? You don't support them, they go away. The same is true of general stores. Listen, we're all going to go online and buy something from Amazon. That's fine. And we're all going to go online and buy something else from some other. That's not the point. The point is you still have to make time to go and buy stuff from local stores, or they will go away. So the entrepreneurship thing is important, because I always say general stores are not museums, okay? We may like to think of them in some respects that way, but they're not museums. They're businesses, and you have to support them. So in that sense, it is about entrepreneurship, but the good ones understand about that third place. Because you could be great and offer all kinds of great products, but in this day and age, what people are really looking for is that gathering place.
But the interest, I think it's Harvard, Massachusetts, where there was a general store. And
Still is.
And I believe it went out of business or in the process of being sold or something. But that.
The Harvard store?
No, I think it was.
It did. It went through 2 changes of ownership. But as far as I know, it's still open. I'll double check on that.
That's an example of, that's really a community store.
That is a wonderful community store. And it does all the things we're talking about. Events, programming. They bring the farmer's market inside there in the middle of the winter. The food's great sandwiches, and it's a great example of a third place. So I think entrepreneurship is a crucial part of it. But you won't find any general store that's in business today that's a true community gathering place that today doesn't offer food. That's the part that people have realized what you need to do to get people to tarry, get people to come in and have a reason to stay for a bit, is to get a cup of coffee, get breakfast. Yes, ma'am.
I'm just curious whether you, in your book, you've only looked at stores that are called general store, or have you included some others with different names that actually are a general store of sorts?
So, right. So there's basically two names that these kinds of places go by. Some go by country store.
Right.
Now, that's a distinction without a difference, I've found. And most store owners will, it's completely interchangeable. In fact, right in the beginning of the book, we make a note about that even to store owners that I've polled, it's a distinction without a difference. They're often the same types of places. But when you're talking about something that wouldn't fall into the category of a place that calls itself a country store or general store, what else would it be?
I was actually, as you were talking, it hadn't even occurred to me that there's a little store in Gloucester
Yeah.
called Last Stop, and it's this kind of hole in the wall, but that's where people go. You purposely go to buy your newspaper, you get coffee, you get sandwiches, muffins, because it's
Glass stock?
Last Stop.
Last
It's
stop.
the last store as you're driving out towards east. And
So it's in East Gloucester.
It's in East Gloucester.
Yeah.
Exactly.
Before you get back to the Rotary?
Oh, it's
Before
along
that.
the Eastern Point.
Oh, I
Yeah.
know where it is.
Ah,
It's
okay.
right near Rocky Neck. actually.
Oh, okay.
But I've never thought of it as that, and it's certainly.
Oh, I know exactly the store you're talking about.
Yeah,
Right next to the theater.
exactly.
Yes. Right, of
But I
course.
was thinking that it
I've been in there
doesn't-
many times.
Definitely that.
Now, I haven't been in Last Stop for years, so I don't remember now. I know that, I know I've been in there and got a cup of coffee. Do they have other food? Can you get sandwiches and stuff?
Yeah.
Really?
Huge muffins that probably have
Right.
a billion calories, but everyone goes for those muffins, and it's just.
Yes,
It's
yes.
a go-to place without the.
Yes, I see what you're saying. I see what you're saying. Well, that's a general store by any other name. Right.
Yeah.
And it goes by the name Last Stop. Right. Yes. Yes. Absolutely. Absolutely. In fact, I'm glad you asked that because I always point out, people say, well, are all general stores like the ones in the book? Well, so originally I pitched to the publisher doing this on a national level. I wanted to do America's general stores. They didn't want to spend that kind of money. So it became New England. But that's why this is what you have in New England. These are the types of general stores you will find in New England. But when you're talking about a genuine community gathering place, I always make the point that it doesn't have to look like this, and it doesn't have to look like this. Because in Manhattan, in New York City, you can have, I always say, you want to find a general store in New York City? Fine. You can find a bodega, right, on a corner in New York City. As long as it's a neighborhood where people live, that is a general store. That is a community gathering place. That is a third place. The community that we're talking about may be a community of people who live within 4 blocks. But for them, they expect to see people that they run into who are in their 4 blocks of Manhattan. That's a general store. That's a community gathering place. So it doesn't have to look like a New England general store. It has to be a community gathering place. And it doesn't matter what the community is, right? It's like what constitutes a family. There's no definition. Constitutes a family is people who love each other and want to be together. That's a family. You can't define it any other way. Yes?
I'm just curious if they ever caught the arsonist.
No,
in Putney.
they never did. Unsolved mystery. They never solved the arsonist. However, the people in Putney do take great, so that was, 20 years, almost 20, they take great comfort in the fact that very frequently arsonists will strike again in the same vicinity. There hasn't, knock on wood, been another fire in that time. So the sense is that whoever this person was transited on through. And today, the Putney store, the local banks like to joke that you really should put your money in the Putney General Store because it's more secure now than most of the banks in the area. So, any other questions? And yes,
Way back in the beginning when you showed the cars in the 50s going
Yeah.
down the highway, my first thought that came to me was, well, those are fleeing their local area to go to better bargains. Today, we're in our cars fleeing to go look for the quaint country store.
Isn't that funny? Because the local bargains have gotten so close to home, right? You don't have to go far. Or you just go online, you don't even have to get in your car at all. So you get in your car to actually find the things that were put out of business.
But this is an experience to go to a country store.
Yes.
It's
But-
happening. It's a Sunday afternoon drive.
But that's the key word you just said. That's the key word you just said, the experience. You know, I said in the beginning that general stores are not revered because of anything they sell. It's the experience. It's the experience that they offer. It's like any third place, right? It's like any genuine third place. You can't replicate it, and you certainly can't find it online. You can find a great deal on Amazon for what you're looking for, right? But Amazon will never be able to offer a community gathering place. So, anyone, you had one last question. Yeah.
One of the most unusual gathering points, I think, in Metro West is Casey's Diner.
Ah, I love Casey's
I
Diner.
mean, that is
Yes.
a gathering point.
Yes.
That is,
Yes, and you know, and as long as you only, you know, get a couple of hot dogs there with everything on it once a year, your doctor won't get mad at you.
once a year, unfortunately.
Love Casey. So listen, thank you very much for coming out tonight and joining me. I really appreciate it. It's my third visit here in Wayland, and I really appreciate it. I'll tell you what. I am going to set up shop over here. We'll turn the lights back on. I'll be over here. If you would like to purchase a book, I'd be delighted to sign one for you. I not only have my newest book at General Stores, but I have my last book, Wicked Pissed, all about New England's general feuds. All about, it's a general look at, and there's a whole store of them in here, but including Red Sox Yankees. But, and my first book, New England Notebook, which is my only hardcover, but it is a collection of all my favorite stories culled from my 25 years of reporting around New England. So if you'd like to buy one, I'll be over here, whether you buy a book or not. I have a sign-up list right here for my newsletter. So if you would like to get on my newsletter, I can promise you, you will get no unwanted spam from me. In fact, if you give me your email address, there's a 50-50 chance you'll never hear from me again. But I shouldn't say that. That's not good entrepreneurship. You will hear from me. Anyway, thank you very much for coming tonight. I'll be over here. Thank you. Bye-bye. Could someone hit the lights in the back? Thank you.